For decades, Rob Reiner has been regarded as a revered Hollywood icon, a talented director, a figure with profound influence behind the scenes. But what happens when Albert Brooks, who worked closely with him, unexpectedly speaks out and reveals a completely different perspective? The stories, experiences, and details mentioned have led many to question, does the public truly understand the man and the power behind Rob Reiner? In today's video, we will analyze these controversial statements, the context behind them, and why many believe the truth is far more complex than previously known. If you're interested in these rarely discussed behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next in-depth and objective analysis. It breaks my heart to have to talk about this. There's a very real, very heavy pain, but strangely, I still feel the need to speak out. Because in Hollywood, silence is rarely accidental, and even more rarely unconditional. Most of the time, silence is exchanged as a form of invisible currency, used to protect legacy, safeguard reputation, and maintain images worth billions of dollars. But the silence surrounding Albert Brooks has a completely different nuance. It's not a strategy, nor is it a crisis management effort by lawyers or the media team. This is a silence born from deep-seated pain, a pain that seeks no justification and refuses to bow down. What makes that pain even more agonizing is the history behind it. This isn't a typical entertainment industry relationship built on premieres or reciprocal benefits. Albert Brooks and Rob Reiner have known each other for over 6 decades, long before the spotlight, before awards, before fame, before All in the Family, before directorial contracts, before their names were unknown. They were just 2 boys who loved laughter and jokes, harboring big dreams, unaware of how complicated and heavy the future would be. Albert once said he met Rob when he was 14, and even now, there are moments when he still can't believe things turned out that way. Therefore, when Albert finally spoke about what really happened inside the Brentwood house, people were compelled to listen. His words were unpolished, unedited, and devoid of any visual strategy. They were raw, direct, and full of emotion, disappointment, regret, and anger intertwined, pouring out in a way that completely overturned the story the public was familiar with. Many people just skim the headlines and move on, viewing it as another sad piece of news among countless others. But this case demands more than a superficial glance. Albert isn't just mourning a lifelong friend. He's revealing a silent, long-standing breakdown, one that was avoided, rationalized, and pushed aside for convenience and politeness. He speaks of things that those in power usually only dare to whisper behind closed doors. While the public narrative has largely revolved around Nick, shrouded in the image of unconditional love and the absolute sacrifice of his parents, Albert's perspective is different. He doesn't deny that love, but he refuses to romanticize the reality. What he tells is heavier, more unsettling, and more truthful because he was there, witnessed every sign of the cracks, every moment when things gradually spiraled out of control while everyone else chose to remain silent. He likened it to seeing a disaster approaching when no one had the courage to say, "This isn't okay." And most importantly, he wasn't criticizing Rob for loving his son. The issue was never that simple. What Albert consistently emphasizes isn't the absence of love, but the dark side of unconditional love when it refuses to confront the truth. According to him, love, when blinded, when deliberately ignoring clear warning signs, ceases to be a protective shield and gradually transforms into complicity. And that's the word Albert repeats many times, complicity, not out of malice, but out of a fear of admitting that something has gone too far. When love only knows how to shield, it inadvertently opens the way for larger problems to develop in silence. Instead of choosing a noisy stage or a dialogue with a famous interviewer, Albert chose a more discreet but far more personal path. He shared his story in private conversations with a small group of industry veterans, people who had known Rob before his fame changed everything. They understood the context, understood what couldn't be said publicly, and it was from those seemingly disjointed exchanges that the pieces gradually emerged, revealing a picture that sent chills down many people's spines. Albert didn't speak in generalities or metaphors. He went into detail. He recounted a specific evening, a few months before everything truly collapsed. It was an intimate, unhurried dinner with no foreshadowing of the event. Just Rob, Michelle, Albert, and a few familiar faces. No one expected anything unusual to happen until Nick appeared. For those who had experienced prolonged family crises, that moment was all too familiar. The atmosphere changed instantly. The conversation stalled. Eyes met in silence. But according to Albert, Rob's reaction was unlike what one might expect. It wasn't fear, nor exactly disappointment, but hope. A painful hope, as if this time things would be different, as if this could be a turning point. Albert paused for a long time when mentioning that moment, and those listening could feel the weight in his words. For hope, however beautiful, when repeatedly negated by reality, can become dangerous. It causes people to cling, procrastinate, and refuse to act when action is most necessary. Albert had known Rob since high school. They were lifelong friends, and he never said Nick was beyond saving. Nor did he ever say Rob was a failed father. What Albert was trying to convey was simpler, yet more painful. Ignoring the storm doesn't make it disappear. It is at this point that his words become haunting, because the story is not just about one family or one house in Brentwood. It reflects a broader culture where image is valued over action, where silence is rewarded and honesty is often seen as inconvenient. Albert's voice, when he spoke, was not bitter. It was weary, heavy, as if he wished he had spoken sooner. And once you heard his version, it was hard to put it aside. Memories of a long-standing friendship, of their first meeting as teenagers, were recounted with rare sincerity. They had known each other since they were very young, quickly becoming close friends, bound together through their years before fame and glory. Albert recounted that Rob jumped up when Nick walked in, extending his arms as if to pull his son closer, trying to maintain the facade of calm. But Nick hadn't come to talk or mend things. He had come with a big demand, a demand for money. The kind of money people often use to delay confronting problems that should have been solved long ago. Albert said that moment changed the color of the room. The comfort was gone, replaced by a heavy, lingering feeling in the air, signaling that what had been buried for too long had finally reached its limit. All conversation in the room suddenly died down. No one touched the dishes anymore. And then Michelle appeared. When Albert looked at her, he didn't see the annoyance or disappointment one might expect. What he saw was fear, a real fear, evident in her eyes. That detail was particularly important because, according to Albert, that fear hadn't begun that night. It had existed in that house for years, silently, unnamed, and ignored as if it didn't exist. That moment of meeting her gaze made Albert realize he couldn't remain silent any longer. He pulled Rob away from the table, out onto the porch, where no one else could hear. There were no gentle words, no beating around the bush. Albert directly asked his closest friend a question that would haunt him later. How long do you intend to let this bind you? What haunted Albert wasn't the question, but the answer. Rob didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He looked utterly exhausted, like someone who had carried too much burden for too long. And then Rob said something Albert would never forget. If I stop, I'll lose him. In Rob's mind, backing down meant losing his son forever. He believed that money, care, and his constant presence were the last thread keeping everything from falling apart. What Rob didn't realize, according to Albert, was that shielding Nick from all consequences had inadvertently brought danger closer to the family. That's also why Albert was so irritating to many. He refused to make mental health an absolute excuse. Not something to be ignored, but not a shield of immunity for all behavior either. We live in an age where every story is wrapped in familiar explanations: trauma, pressure, addiction, parenting. And it's true that Nick struggled. Substance abuse wasn't a secret. But Albert spoke about it with such bluntness that it made the listener uncomfortable. He shared that he grew up in an environment of addiction, witnessed many people lost, many families broken, but most of them didn't cross such dangerous boundaries. Albert rejected the idea that Nick was simply a victim of his own mind. According to him, something darker was at play. Not just disappointment, but deep resentment, and anger directed straight at the very people who raised him. And then Albert touched on a part that mainstream media often avoids: envy. Imagine growing up in the enormous shadow of Rob Reiner. Every step was placed alongside works that had become legendary. Names everyone knew, unattainable standards. When the surname you carry weighs so heavily, finding your own identity is almost impossible. Albert recalled a moment many years ago on a film set. A casual mention of Rob was enough to send Nick into a rage. Not a playful, fleeting fit of anger, but genuine fury. According to Albert, it wasn't youthful rebellion. It was the accumulated bitterness that arises when one feels perpetually invisible beside the greatness of others. In Albert's view, Nick wasn't just seeking money. He wanted to shatter the image, to dismantle the legacy and the foundation that had overshadowed his life. And Albert believed that this wasn't accidental, but a deliberate choice. A move Albert believed was intended to shatter the image that had haunted Nick his entire life. And now, what angered Albert wasn't just what had happened, but what he saw unfolding before him. From his perspective, a legal strategy was beginning to emerge. Albert knew it. His defense attorney, Alan Jackson, was experienced, shrewd, and calculating. Albert said he could see the scenario from afar, portraying Nick as a fragile young man, abandoned by the system, weighed down by pressure and expectations to the point of unbearable strain. And what Albert feared most was how that narrative would convince the public. He warned anyone willing to listen not to let the story be reversed, because the next step was all too predictable. Blame. Make Rob the problem. Say he was too controlling, or conversely, not controlling enough. Say the Reiner name was a burden, that somehow the parents had brought about their own demise. Albert said that was the cruelest part of it all. Those who died couldn't defend themselves. They no longer had the chance to explain their choices, couldn't argue, couldn't correct the distortions. And that's why Albert chose to speak up now. He wasn't seeking attention. He was intervening. He saw himself as the voice Rob could no longer voice. Because if he remained silent, the story would be rewritten by people who were never there, who never witnessed what truly happened. And Albert was determined not to let that happen. He was not only a witness to the love that existed in that house, but also a witness to the wounds Rob had silently endured for years. According to Albert, what was difficult for people to accept right now was that truth. Because it wasn't just temporary chaos or confusion. There were moments that crossed the line, causing deep emotional pain, and Rob accepted it all in silence. There was a story Albert told that plunged the room into silence. It revolved around Michelle Reiner. In Albert's eyes, Michelle had always been the balance, the creative soul, an artist, a photographer, someone who always tried to smooth things over and keep the family together. He even hesitated to mention her name in this context. Albert revealed that just weeks before everything fell apart, Michelle had called him unexpectedly. She didn't explain much. She didn't mention Nick. She didn't specify what was happening. She only asked about security. She asked about the safe room. Let's stop at that detail. This wasn't someone living in a dangerous or unprotected area. This was Brentwood, a discreet, secure residential area with controlled access. Michelle wasn't afraid of strangers. According to Albert, her fear was directed towards an acquaintance, someone who knew the code, someone who could walk in without knocking. Albert advised her to change things immediately. Change the code. Hire professional security. Create a clear distance between fear and reality. What still haunts Albert is whether Michelle actually followed his advice. That thought still lingers in his mind. He replays that call, wondering if he should have driven there himself, if doing more could have changed anything. The guilt is evident in his voice whenever he mentions it. You have to understand how deep that friendship was. Albert Brooks and Rob Reiner were more than just close friends. They were almost two versions of the same person, just expressed differently. They shared instincts, a similar sense of humor, and started their careers at the same time. They grew up together, built their careers together. For Albert, losing Rob was more than just losing a friend. He felt like he had lost half his world. Those who worked with Rob also spoke of this. They spoke of a generous, warm person, always ready to support others when they were just starting out. Some said that without Rob, they wouldn't have been able to complete their first film. Others simply recounted their experience working with him on set as a rare and beautiful memory in their careers. These accounts weren't meant to build a perfect image, but to remind everyone that behind all the controversies, Rob Reiner was a person who left a profound mark on the lives of many around him. Rob Reiner has long been considered one of the most progressive and influential voices in the industry. His father, Carl Reiner, was a true legend, leaving a profound mark not only in his career but also in his character. Albert had met Carl and had felt his warmth and wisdom. Because of this, the pain Albert carries goes beyond mere loss, gradually transforming into something colder, more explicit, a purposeful resentment. Albert believes he is lifting the veil of glamour that Hollywood often uses to protect powerful families. According to him, this scenario is all too familiar. When the children of celebrities run into trouble, an entire machine immediately kicks up. Carefully crafted statements, calls for secrecy, and covert efforts to resolve the situation behind the scenes. Albert believes that this systemic silence is what caused things to spiral further out of control. He said that if someone had intervened earlier, more directly, years ago, the outcome might have been very different. Albert recounted an incident that, in his opinion, should have been a wake-up call. A violent outburst that was alarming, a moment that should have prompted serious intervention. But that didn't happen. No authorities. No clear boundaries. From Albert's perspective, the reason is simple. This wasn't a normal family. Instead of the usual procedures, they called a private doctor, called a manager, called connections that could quietly make everything disappear. That was the accusation Albert made, without beating around the bush or softening it. In his view, privilege didn't protect this family. It imprisoned them. When consequences are always avoided, there will never be a real stopping point. There was always a buffer, always someone to mediate, always a way to defuse the situation until things spiraled out of control. Albert said that system failed not because of a lack of power, but because it chose to yield instead of setting limits. And the price of that yielding, he said, was devastating. Those who had recently heard Albert speak noticed he was different. Fewer smiles, less of the sharp wit that had been his trademark. Instead, a weary look, as if the shock had weighed heavily on every word. Albert recounted how he learned the news, and it sent shivers down many spines. He hadn't received a call from his family. The news reached him through a work acquaintance who had overheard the information on the emergency communication system. The thought of having to learn about his best friend indirectly, before anyone called directly, still haunted him. Albert said he drove straight to Brentwood. The lights, the barriers, the chaos unfolded before his eyes. He tried to approach, tried to explain that he was a relative, but nothing worked. The officers didn't recognize him. Or perhaps it didn't matter. To them, he was just another elderly man desperate behind the security fence. That image was etched into Albert's memory, standing outside, helpless, while the people he loved were reduced to files, procedures, and reports. No history, no context, only papers. When the trial was scheduled, Albert made it clear he would be there. He intended to sit in the front row, right behind the prosecution. He wanted Nick to see him, to look him straight in the eye. Albert remembered every promise made in the past, every defense, every attempt to defuse the situation. He saw himself as a living witness to years that had never made the front page of the newspapers, and that's what made him unpredictable in the eyes of the defense. He didn't speak with hypothesis. He spoke with memory, and he was too tired of silence. Meanwhile, the rest of Reiner's family spoke up, hoping for peace. They asked for privacy to deal with their grief in their own way. Albert said he understood, but in his mind, silence had once come at too high a price. This time, he didn't want it to win again. Apologies had been offered, and each person had the right to choose how they faced their loss. They were grieving in the only way those who remained could, while carrying wounds that no one could truly see from the outside. Alongside their own grief, those left behind are trying to preserve the memories of Rob and Michelle without completely erasing Nick from their lives. It's a fragile, almost unbalanced line, where every step risks shattering everything. Yet they walk that line with remarkable composure and patience, as if it were the only way to continue existing. Albert, however, didn't choose that path, and he never hid his difference. Why? Because Albert wasn't a blood relative. He didn't bear the obligation to forgive at all costs, nor was he compelled to maintain harmony to preserve the family. He was Rob's friend, and for Albert, that friend didn't need gentle, comforting words or superficial reassurance. Rob needed accountability. Albert believed that grief didn't necessarily have to be accompanied by silence, and forgiveness didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. While his brothers chose peace so they could continue living with their memories, Albert chose to confront the truth, however painful it might be. That choice put him in direct conflict with those in power, and he accepted the price. Albert publicly expressed his outrage at the industry's reaction. Long posts, carefully crafted messages, and emotionally charged statements flooded the public sphere. People said they were heartbroken, that they would miss the laughter, that they had just lost a wonderful person. But Albert frankly pointed out that many of them hadn't spoken to Rob for years. Some stopped answering the phone. Some quietly withdrew when things became awkward and inconvenient. And there were those who knew Nick was unstable, whispering to each other privately, warning each other behind closed doors, yet still inviting Nick to parties, still letting him appear everywhere, simply because of the last name he bore. Albert didn't name anyone. He didn't need to. Those involved understood perfectly well who he was talking about. He called it feigned grief, public display of emotion without personal responsibility, a charade staged after it was too late to change. Albert didn't care about timely and appropriate condolences. What he wanted was answers. He wanted to know who had aided Nick that night, who had taken him to that house, who had secretly protected him, shielded him, and cleaned up the mess. He wanted all the layers of disguise stripped away, even if it made many people uncomfortable. And that's why this story transcends the realm of a celebrity tragedy. It's a vivid example of what happens when money, fame, fear, and uncontrolled behavior clash. It forces us to confront unsettling questions. Where should love end? And when should responsibility begin? When does tolerance turn into complicity? And what is the true price of silence? Rob Reiner has dedicated his life to telling stories where love triumphs. His films have taught generations that love can overcome any obstacle, that true love will heal all wounds. But Albert stands amidst the ruins, saying something no one wants to hear. Love didn't prevent this tragedy. In his view, it was love that made it possible. Love opened the doors. Love kept pathways that should have been closed wide open. And this cruel reversal makes everything more painful than any direct accusation. Albert recounts a moment at the memorial service that silenced everyone present. He sat with Jake and Roy, flipping through old photographs. Rob on set, focused and passionate. Michelle smiling, radiant as light. Family moments were preserved, as if time had never touched them. Then they found a photograph from about 15 years ago. The whole family stood together. Nick was there, smiling, calm, looking completely normal, as if he were a natural part of the frame. Albert's first reaction was anger. He wanted to push the photograph away, as if he could erase it from his memory. To him, it was like a framed lie hanging on the wall. But Jake and Roy stopped him. To them, the image wasn't a symbol of trauma. It was still their brother, a version of him that existed before everything fell apart. That difference in perspective spoke volumes. That's where the real tension lay. The family needed to cling to good memories to continue living. The friend couldn't separate the past from the present. No one was wrong. They were simply carrying different burdens in irreplaceable ways. The impact of all this on Albert was very real and very heavy. He was over 70, and this kind of stress didn't simply disappear with time. Long sleepless nights, recurring moments in his mind, uncontrollable anger. The impact of all this on Albert was very real and very heavy. He was over 70, and this kind of stress didn't simply disappear with time. Long sleepless nights, recurring moments in his mind, anger that wouldn't subside no matter how hard he tried. Albert implied that time now held a different meaning for him, not because of the fear of death, but because grief had reshaped both his mind and body. Rob wasn't just a friend. He was a fundamental part of Albert's life, someone who had been there every step of the way, from his early, unknown days to when things became too big, too complicated, and beyond everyone's control. Albert once shared a memory from years ago on a chaotic film set. where jokes followed one another and laughter seemed endless. Amidst all the noise, Rob was the only one who could make Albert laugh until he couldn't breathe. It was a carefree, natural, effortless laugh. But now, that laughter is gone. In its place is a heavy, indescribable silence. Albert says he tried to re-watch their old work, tried to sit back and relive the memories, the moments that once lightened his life. But he couldn't. The screen faded, and all that remained was silence. Each smile on screen brought with it other images in his mind, images he couldn't shake off. Albert says that silence was louder than any sound he had ever heard. That's why he continues to speak, not to attract attention, nor to seek revenge or sow more resentment. He said the silence had taken too much, and he refused to let it steal anything more. According to Albert, something else had also been taken, something many people weren't ready to admit. He said Nick not only took Rob out of this world, but also his legacy. How could anyone watch films once filled with joy without considering the tragedy behind them? The joy was still there, but it was tinged with an inescapable sadness. Laughter still echoed, but now it carried a weight it had never possessed before. But the detail that troubled Albert most wasn't related to money, fame, or cinema. It lay in Nick's eyes. Albert said that in his last encounters with Nick, he sensed a void. Not sadness, not anger, not even a loss of control, but an emptiness. He described it as like a building after everyone has left. The lights were still on, the structure intact, but inside it was utterly empty. What made this memory even more painful was Albert's belief that Rob saw it too. Both looked at the same reality, but they perceived it in two completely different ways. Albert saw danger, a moment to step back, a signal that it was time to distance themselves, to protect themselves. Rob, on the other hand, saw pain, a pain that needed to be embraced, soothed by patience, love, and presence. That difference in perspective was where everything began to fall apart. One rushed toward the fire, carrying hope like water to extinguish it. The other stood afar, calling for retreat, and the one carrying hope was consumed by that fire. As the trial approached, Albert made it clear he would no longer remain silent. He would no longer play the role of the jester, no longer the voice behind the scenes. He's stepping into a different role, even if it makes many people uncomfortable. Albert understands how this system works very well. He knows how stories can be manipulated in court. He understands how emotions, childhood memories, and embellished narratives can influence the listener's perception. He also knows that powerful legal teams always find ways to blur the lines, enough to make accountability elusive. That's why Albert chose to speak out now. He wants to draw a clear line. His message is straightforward. Rob and Michelle aren't heartless or cruel. They're not bad people. They are deeply and genuinely loving parents. And in Albert's view, it's that very love that makes them vulnerable. That's hard to accept. It goes against our instinct, the instinct to surround grieving families with silence and unconditional sympathy. But Albert believed that it was that very silence that betrayed them. For him, the truth was the last form of respect remaining. Not flowery words of comfort, not softened stories, and not the pretense that everything was fine when it was completely different. Albert kept harping on one detail he was determined not to let forget. He said that Rob had been terrified that night, and that was something he wouldn't allow anyone to erase. Albert didn't want the world to believe that Rob simply passed away peacefully, as if the story had been softened to make it more palatable. He wanted people to understand that there was fear, confusion, and panic, and that fear was the core issue. It was important in a legal context. It was important for the concept of responsibility. And most importantly, because, according to Albert, the consequences had to reflect what actually happened, not a softened version to make others feel better. For Albert, this wasn't revenge. This was pain honed into purpose. It was a demand that the pain not be lessened, and the truth not be diluted. Therefore, as updates on the case began to spread on social media, as legal analyses and procedures monopolized attention, Albert wanted people to stop. Ignore the dry jargon. Ignore the delays, the formal arguments. Imagine Albert sitting alone in his house, surrounded by 6 decades of memories. Old jokes, shared milestones, conversations that could never be repeated. And when one understands that, one understands why he couldn't remain silent. Albert said he was waiting for a phone call. Not a call announcing a delay. Not a call full of legal jargon, carefully orchestrated reasons. He was waiting for the final call, the call that acknowledged responsibility. But even if that call came, Albert knew one thing for sure. It wouldn't bring peace. It wouldn't fill the empty rooms, wouldn't soothe the echoes still reverberating in his memory. This wasn't a movie. There was no plot twist at the end. No unexpected moment of redemption. No climactic music that seemed to bring everything to a complete resolution. Life doesn't work like that. It just fades, slowly and coldly. And Albert stood there, not turning away. He kept repeating that the signs had been there before. The warnings were real. The unease had been felt. It was just avoided because avoiding it was easier than facing it. According to Albert, the real question wasn't whether this story would end. It certainly would. The question was whether anyone had actually learned anything from it. Because then the media would try to smooth things over. They would replay old speeches, show smiling images, talk about healing and moving on. Albert was here to remind us that the wound was still open. It still ached. And it was still unresolved. The most difficult truth he kept repeating was this: the people closest to us aren't always the safest place. Sometimes, the only one who sees danger is the friend standing on the sidelines, shouting amidst the noise, helplessly watching the unstoppable approach. And at this point, the question is actually very simple. Thank you for taking the time to watch until the very end of this video. If the story you just heard made you think, please leave a comment to share your perspective. We always read and appreciate every opinion. Don't forget to like if you found the content valuable, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more in-depth analyses and stories with more layers of meaning behind a glamour. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue bringing you more authentic, thoughtful, and thought-provoking content. See you in the next video.